skin fold places the skin in the high dose region. So here, the skin is receiving, in this case, 102% of the prescribed dose to the breast. The skin.
Can I just ask some of our listeners to please close your microphones? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it might have been causing a bit of interference there. All right, so if the skin fold places the skin in a high dose region, that creates a higher risk for the development of severe skin reactions. And by that, we normally mean moist desquamation. And back in 2008, an excellent study was done looking at radiation dermatitis for our more modern IRMT technique. We still use this very similar technique to what we use today. And they found that 31% of all patients getting IRMT for breast were developing some moist desquamation. And this was most likely to occur in the infra-mammary crease and for larger tissue volumes. And it really does become a quality of life issue for patients on treatment and after treatment. The other issue with breast positioning on the chest wall relates to the dose to organs at risk. So in breast radiotherapy, we typically use a parallel opposed set of beams, a medial and a lateral, as you can see here. And again, the high dose volume is in red. And what you can observe is that there's sometimes a substantial amount of lung and some heart in the beam, in the field. So this can lead to complications later on down the road, things like pneumonitis or fibrosis and cardiac complications are not that frequent these days, but they can occur depending on the quality of the treatment plan. So positioning the breast to a more anterior position on the chest wall will help us reduce dose to organs at risk as well. So we started this a few years ago, and at the time, we did a quick survey of what was on the market for breast positioning, and there were 3 commercial options. And I think these are still the 3 commercial options available. There's a bra arrangement, thermoplastic shell, which is familiar to most people, and the Civco breast cup, which is a thin 0.6 millimeter plastic device that comes with a strap. So for all of these, there are some drawbacks that prevented us from wanting to implement any of them as a mainstream clinical practice technique. We looked at this one in particular and found it quite difficult to use. There's really very little data published on the efficacy of these techniques. There's a little bit more data on this one, and there is some skin dose data that I'll allude to a little bit later. But we felt that these were not what we were looking for. So then we decided to sort of see what we could come up with on our own. And so that's what I'll be talking to you today about. Effectively, there's a sequence of 5 studies that we carried out, beginning with a device design and build study, followed by a surface dose study, and a clinical pilot study to look at the feasibility of treatment. That included an in vivo dose study. Then we sort of circled back and did an investigation into some new carbon fiber material systems. Finally, we were really quite happy with what we developed and embarked on a randomized clinical trial versus standard of care. So first study was design and build. We needed some funding, we needed a REB protocol, etc. So once we were ready, we embarked on this study first by setting some design specifications to guide us. First and foremost, we had to eliminate infra-mammary skin folds. We also needed to keep the skin dose below 80% of the prescribed dose to the breast. And this is an estimate based on the expert opinions at our center among the breast oncology group. It should be easy to use, weigh less than 1 kilogram, be quick to set up, less than 5 minutes, be compatible with DIBH, deep inspiration breath hold, which really helps spare cardiac dose, and needed to be comfortable, of course, for the patient, and ideally cleanable, reusable, and universal for all patients. So in the design study, we effectively carried out 3D optical surface imaging on our participants because most of them were not patients. We collected a lot of biometric data, size, shape, radius of curvature, and so on. And in order to do rapid prototyping, so we could try out a lot of different sizes, shapes, orientations, we used 3D printing just to produce multiple versions of the support. And then again, we did non-invasive assessment of the efficacy of the support, just really by observation. So after about 6 months, we had a viable design. And here is the 3D printed prototype that seemed to work the best. So based on 10 participants of a wide range of sizes and shapes, we found that this shape and this method of fixation was able to remove the infra-mammary fold in all cases and to really provide excellent lateral breast support. So we then went on to fabricate the carbon fiber version of that plastic breast support, which would not have been suitable for treatment. And here you see it mounted on a conventional breast board with the wing board and a hand grip here. So this is all just the conventional equipment. And this is the new part. There's a carbon fiber frame that fits over the patient's hips basically and is mounted on a base plate under the breastboard. The base plate is indexed to the couch. And this is really the support here on an indexed bracket that allows it to slide left, right, down, and out. So we can customize the settings for any patient. There's also an angular adjustment here on the scoop. So now I will just bring this over and show you what it looks like in practice. So again, design criteria said must be easy to use. So here are two of our therapists at the CT sim. The base plate was placed under the breastboard before the patient got on. You can see that they put the frame across the hips and then are adjusting the settings for this particular patient to reposition her breast on the chest wall in a more favorable position, eliminating her skin fold infra-mammary and providing lateral support. So that looks pretty good. And then they simply go on to record the settings with the standard marks on the patient for setup. And then they will record the individualized settings for the patient. Those numbers go on the setup sheet and translated to the treatment unit. Okay. So at this point, we felt we had a pretty viable design. It functioned very well. And the remaining design criterion to check was the surface dose. Can we use this on patients without the surface dose being a problem? So started off with a very simple geometry, Marcus chamber and solid water under layers of the carbon fiber woven fabric that we intended to use in the construction. And no surprise, due to the very steep dose gradient in the buildup region, for 10 MV, we found that the material of choice at the time was going to increase the surface dose by about 15%. And for 6MV, a little bit more, 22%. So again, this was very simple geometry. In fact, really not the clinical geometry. So just a reminder about the treatment geometry for breast. And this is kind of sort of physics 101, if you like. So sorry if it seems simple, but just to remind you, in breast radiation therapy, we talk about the breast separation, which is the distance between the entrance surface and the exit surface, which I've put here on this schematic of the depth dose curve. And the prescription is normally to around mid-breast. And of course, Dmax then sometimes becomes more than 100%, depending on the separation and the choice of beam energy. And of course, we don't use a single beam. We use a parallel opposed beam arrangement, giving effect more or less equally weighting the lateral and medial beam. So the dose sums at this point. And of course, the total dose to the skin is also the sum of the entrance dose in the buildup region and the exit dose, or the build down region, from each of those beams. So just summarizing what that looks like, we get, depending on the breast separation, hopefully a uniform dose to the breast volume, trying to keep the hot spots low by appropriate choice of beam energy. And here's our design criteria for 80% of dose to this, 80% of the prescription dose to the skin is what we're looking for. And you can see here that, again, very, very sharp dose gradient in the buildup region, but certainly should be an achievable target. So wanting a little bit more flexibility in our geometry for measuring the surface dose, we adopted a film technique, which certainly your group has some of the world leading experts in this field. So made it easy for us to simply adopt a technique that had been published on, and then really just needed to validate the accuracy and reproducibility for our own site here. So we did a couple of things to achieve that. We looked at comparisons with our Eclipse treatment planning system. And here is a very simple 5x5 field inside a 10x10 field. And we're looking at the dose volume, or dose area histogram of the film result compared with Eclipse. And if we zero in here on a higher dose region, we, in this case, got the best agreement between the green channel and the Eclipse data. And that was fairly confidence building. And then to go a step further, we did validate our film technique as well using Monte Carlo simulation of the surface dose. And this week, we presented a little bit of this at the APEM this summer, so I won't go further into that, just in the interest of time. Suffice it to say, we're very happy with the results of our film technique and feel quite confident using it going forward.
Hi.
So we then wanted to look at a little bit more representative situation for breast RT, and this is a bit busy, but let's focus first on the lateral beam's eye view of our simple phantom setup. And imagine for a minute that this is breast sitting on the chest wall, and we will have a lateral beam aperture looking like this with some what we would call flash or overrun of the beam above and to the inferior surface of the breast to allow for setup uncertainty and positioning variability on the unit. So this is our very simple solid water block phantom. And this is the lateral beam's eye view, and this is a view from the top. And we're normalizing all of our film results to a depth of 10. And in fact, this is really in the center of the breast volume. So just one more look at that anterior view of our simple phantom for surface dose measurements for breast RT. We have We're going to monitor the dose at the lateral entrance surface, the lateral exit surface, and two regions on the inferior phantom/breast surface, proximal to the beam and distal to the beam, and normalize everything to mid-breast prescription point. Here's what the phantom looks like. Just a block of solid water with the carbon fiber overlays that tightly taped on to make sure that we had good contact between the skin and the overlay. So some results here, starting with the lateral breast surface. And again, remember, we're trying to keep the skin dose on all surfaces below the 80% design specification. So we compared what we would see on bare skin with no overlay to what we see with the carbon fiber overlay. And again, entrance build up, exit build down. The sum of those is the total dose to the skin. So bare skin was getting about 50%, and not unexpectedly, the carbon fiber overlay was causing about a 20% increase in the skin dose at these two regions. And then the inferior breast surface. And again, this is where we're really working on removing the infra-mammary fold to get the skin dose down below 100%. So the proximal and distal doses on the inferior skin add up for the two beams. And in air or bare skin, that inferior breast surface is getting about 65% of the dose, and the carbon fiber overlay is taking the dose a little bit above our design spec. So it's getting about 85% of the dose here. And again, this is for 6 MV beams and a 20 centimeter separation. And the 6 MV beam will in fact will be the best case to look at because it generally comes with the highest surface dose. So just putting all this data together, the take-home message is that the inferior breast surface is systematically getting a higher dose than the lateral breast surface. And the lateral breast surface is below the design spec in terms of dose, but the inferior breast surface is a little bit above our design spec. However, we must remember that in the presence of a large skin fold, that skin will be getting possibly more than 100%. So based on those results, we decided to do a little bit more preclinical testing. And Bradford Guild, some of you may have known him. He's another McGill grad, and Emily embarked on making some phantoms. Here I'm just showing the carbon fiber scoop as we manufacture it. So again, this is all just in-house at the moment, or at this time. This was in-house stuff that you can buy off the shelf, and you need a good mold, carbon fiber overlay into a vacuum bag, put it through a heat curing cycle, and out pops your carbon fiber part. So again, Emily and Brad embarked on making some silicone phantoms so we could test the device itself and not just the flat sheets. So here it is on the silicone phantom and ready for some further testing. So we simply, cut that gaff chromic film to the shape of the paddle and insert it between the paddle and the scattering phantom material here, which gave us a nice fit. And this allowed us to look at some dose difference maps with the carbon fiber paddle in place. So we looked at the difference between the skin or the surface dose with the CARA support versus without. And we were able to draw some further conclusions about the safety of the device. So one thing we noticed on the inferior surface was quite a visible scatter artifact from the attachment piece. So that led us to redesign that before continuing. And the other thing to note was that the lateral surface dose was actually increasing more with the carbon fiber in place than the inferior surface. So the increase in dose was higher for the lateral surface, but of course the overall dose was was higher for the inferior surface, if that makes sense. Okay, the other thing we were able to show is that if you can imagine, this is actually curved in 3D, and this is where the bend is. So what we found here was that indeed we were not creating a hot spot under the paddle at the bend. So to summarize the results of this study, we certainly are seeing a higher inferior breast surface dose than lateral. So the lack of electronic equilibrium in the dose buildup region continues to provide skin sparing on the lateral surface. Lateral surface dose is below 80%. Inferior surface dose was greater than 80%. We removed the scatter artifact by redesigning. We decided based on these findings to go ahead with the clinical testing of the first prototype, with the understanding that if we were removing skin folds, we would be benefiting the patient, even though that inferior skin dose was not meeting our initial design specification. So study number 3 is then the clinical pilot study, again, funding protocol clinical procedures. But the idea here was to establish treatment safety and feasibility using this breast support. So we did CT planning with and without the CARA support. And for the first 10 patients, we simply looked at the treatment planning and we treated them with the standard of care. But the next 20 patients we treated with the CARA support. And the study measures were quite numerous, actually. We wanted to, first of all, make sure that we're covering the planning target volume, looking at dose to organs at risk, looking at hotspots, the irradiated volume of body, skin folds, and some treatment planning parameters such as field length and width, breast separation, monitor units, and beam energy. So here's quite a typical right breast case, on the left with no support, on the right with support. And we see reduced hotspots, subtle here, but there's reduced lung. There's reduced medial lateral breast separation as well. So to review, the patients in this study were up to age 85, body mass index up to 53, 13 left breast and 17 right breast, and infra-mammary folds without any support measuring up to 5 centimeters. So these patients were chosen specifically because they were at high risk of moist desquamation. The prescriptions were as follows: 21 patients received whole breast radiation, 9 patients received whole breast plus regional nodal irradiation. And at this point, there were 3 prescription doses. So quickly looking through the treatment planning parameters, we saw a reduction in the 6 MV utilization, an increase in the 6 MV utilization and a reduction in the higher energies, primarily because of the reduced medial lateral separation, and an increase in the field width, that's the anterior extent of the beam, and a decrease in the field length. And this is, of course, the median difference between the 2 groups, and these were all statistically significant. Some of the dose volume statistics for body and breast, we saw a reduction in the volume of the body within the 95% isodose and 50% isodose of about 270 cubic centimeters, and hotspots in the breast measured by V105% also were reduced by about 70 cubic centimeters, and that's about 4% of the breast volume, all statistically significant. Heart, the difference in heart doses for patients with and without CARA was not significant statistically, but there were some trends to reduced heart dose, and in particularly one patient, there was a very significant decrease in the heart dose. And the lung dose volume statistics were statistically different. V20 gray for the ipsilateral lung for whole breast was reduced by about 28 cubic centimeters, and in whole breast plus regional nodal irradiation by 93 centimeters. So this was very encouraging, and we just published that earlier this year, and quite happy to continue and assess the results for the remaining study that we did in vivo with those 20 patients treated with CARA, looking at both skin dose and skin reactions. So in that patient group, we measured the skin dose between the breast and the paddle on 3 treatment fractions for all 20 patients. And from this, we learned that the hot spot, or the maximum dose to at least 1 centimeter of the skin on the lateral breast surface was distributed, as you see here in green, and the inferior breast surface was receiving systematically a higher dose, and the hot spots were distributed, as you see here in blue. So that was not a surprise to us, but the measured skin doses were a little bit higher than we had expected. The skin reactions were correlated quite nicely with the measured skin dose, and here you see a little bit of desquamation happening and the corresponding dose distribution for this patient. Overall, when we looked at moist desquamation, we observed patchy moist desquamation on the inferior breast in 7 of the 20 patients. 5 of those received the 50 gray prescription, and 2 of those received the lower dose prescription. So these numbers are very, very small, so grain of salt, but 56% of the 50 gray patients, 5 out of 9, developed patchy MD, and 18% of the lower dose. And all of this was on the inferior breast surface, and there was no moist desquamation observed on the lateral breast surface. Summarizing here, the lateral breast surface is very nicely spared. Inferior breast surface showed some reactions. We expect these would be significantly diminished compared with the case where skin folds were present. We do have some historical data here that we looked at. We observed that our skin doses were a bit hotter than we expected. And when we looked at our planning technique, which hadn't been changed for many years, we realized we could cool these off a bit. We were allowing 110% to 20 cc's. So we tightened our dose constraints as a result of this. The other question we asked, can we further improve the design to bring the skin dose down even further? And this was then way beyond our internal expertise. Our in-house carbon fiber expertise certainly was really sort of commoner's knowledge, if you like. So we got some more funding and started a collaboration, which is very exciting, with the Composites Research Network at UBC. And these guys are the experts in carbon fiber material science. So linking up with these guys, we then set a stretch goal to try and reduce the mass per unit area of that carbon fiber scoop by 50%. So this was study number 4. And here you see us accessing some pretty nice software tools that the CRN has for modeling the stress and different forces on parts of various different shapes. And here's our shape. And suffice it to say, we worked on this for about 8 months, I guess, with co-op students and whatnot. And the result was that we do now have a new feather light device that weighs only 13 grams, and the mass per unit area is 0.4 grams per centimeter squared. So this is in fact lower than any the breast devices on the market. And we're really excited to be now moving forward with this version. Of course, a lot of tests were performed on the new material system, and we wanted to make sure it's strong enough. So I'm just showing you here one of the testing machines that they've got out there at the lab. And indeed, it is in fact more than strong enough for our application. So success. So then circle back to the lab here in the clinic to make sure that the surface dose for this new material system is going to be acceptable. And CF2 is the new carbon fiber material system here. And you see it's sort of halfway between air and the original carbon fiber system. So we gained we saw a 10% reduction in surface dose on the lateral breast surface and 8% on the inferior breast surface. And that's now bringing us below the design criterion we had set. All right, so at this point, we had a new material system and a nicely functional design, and we felt we were ready for a randomized controlled trial of this prototype device in our clinic. So that brings us to the protocol design. The primary endpoint for this study is to see if we can reduce the rate of moist desquamation from sort of an expected at least 50% down to 30%. We have 110 patients in each arm of the study for statistical power, and quite a few secondary endpoints, which are consistent with what we were looking at in the pilot study, in addition to patient-reported skin outcomes. And now we're looking at the satisfaction of the radiation therapist working with the device. The study was designed and approved initially in early 2020. And at that point, we were stratifying on 2 dose prescriptions. But along came 2021 and COVID, and some evidence-based practice changes crept in and that we needed to consider in the design of the protocol. So the first and most important one is the introduction of the 26 and 5 fraction prescription ultra hypofractionation schedule. And this was published in 2020 and sort of took off here like wildfire. So that's very important. At the same time, we're also making a slight tweak to our 16 fraction down to 15 fractions. So in order to really understand how including this prescription in the study might affect us, we need to look a little bit more at the radiobiology of skin. And in the late 90s, there was some really exquisite work done by this group on human skin in fractionated radiotherapy. And from that, we obtained a value of alpha over beta of 11 for the development of moist desquamation on breast skin. So that being an acutely responding tissue that shows peak reactions within about 2 weeks of the end of treatment. So using alpha beta ratio of 11, and assuming that the skin gets 100% of the prescribed dose, those treatment fractionation schedules sort of stack up like this. So looking at EQD2, or the dose equivalent to that if delivered in 2 gray fractions, which is this prescription, we see a decreasing sort of effective dose, if you like, for these as the fraction number reduces. So acute effects are definitely expected to be reduced for patients receiving the 26 and 5, unless large skin folds combined with significant hotspots are present in the treatment plan, or if the alpha beta ratio is not 11. So we talked about this quite a bit, but we finally decided to include it in the protocol, and then had to adapt a lot of our other procedures around the fact that some women are now going to receive their complete treatment in 5 days. The other evidence-based practice change had to do with the introduction of partial breast irradiation, which has now become quite popular for the lowest risk patients we see. Because whole breast was a criteria for the study, our recruitment numbers fell off quite a bit. So we decided to include partial breast if the inferior half of the breast, including the skin, is treated. And we're still seeing maybe 20 to 30% of patients requiring whole breast plus nodes, but this number is also dropping. So amendments to the protocol were made, and we are now recruiting in 3 centers in British Columbia, Vancouver, Surrey, and Prince George. And it seems to be going well, a little bit slowly at the beginning. So to summarize all of this, we now offer an effective breast support device to remove skin folds and to reduce organ at risk doses in breast RT. It's available for investigational use at the present time, pending commercialization. And the clinical trial is ongoing, and we're looking for collaborators. And we've learned a lot, as anyone does when they're doing these clinical type of studies. We've also got some ongoing work. We're looking to establish a dose area metric that is predictive of moist desquamation from the data we've got. There are some known metrics already, but we'd like to be a bit more specific. And of course, the end game is to determine how much we can reduce the side effects of breast RT through improved breast positioning. So that brings me to the end of what I talked to you about today. And I always thank the participants who consented to be in our studies. Without them, it's not possible. And of course, we have a fairly large and multidisciplinary team that's worked on studies. So thank you. Thanks for listening. And